I'll introduce our speaker tonight. Our speaker tonight is Lawrence Goldstone. You may be familiar with him if you're ever read into aviation history books. He's the author or the co-author of more than 24 books of both fiction and nonfiction literature. He's written three highly praised books about innovation. It's like an informal trilogy. First of which is Birdmen, the Wright Brothers, Glenn Curtis, and the Battle to Control the Skies, which we'll be talking about tonight. Drive, Henry Ford, George Selden, The Race to Invent the Auto Age, and Going Deep, John Philip Holland, and the Invention of the Attack Submarine. He's also written extensively on constitutional law and equal rights. His book, On Account of Race, the Supreme Court, White Supremacy, and the Ravaging of the African American Voting Rights, won the highly prestigious Lillian Smith Book Award, and Days of Infamy, How a Century of Bigotry Led to Japanese American Infamy, internment, won the 2023 Carter G. Woodson Book Award. Goldstone has been highly interviewed in both radio and television, and his articles, reviews, and opinion pieces have appeared in, among other periodicals, The Atlantic, Salon, New Republic, Boston Globe, and Los Angeles Times, Wall Street Journal, name a newspaper, essentially. And he'll be talking to us tonight about some of basically the scandalous nature between the Wright brothers and Glenn Curtis. And I'll be basically giving a little interview about both sort of his knowledge on the content as well as just basically about writing the book itself. So I'm going to start us off with first interview question, which is what drew you to this particular story and era of history?
Well, I had no interest at all in early aviation, but I was writing a book, a biography of a New York Yankee Hall of Fame baseball pitcher named Lefty Gomez with his daughter. And Lefty was famous for his love of airplanes. In fact, in 1937, he stopped pitching in a World Series game to look at the sky because an airplane was flying over. What's less known about that story was the Yankees were up like 9-2, so it wasn't that big a deal. But going through this with his daughter Vernona, I discovered that Lefty got hooked on aviation as a 6-year-old boy in San Francisco in 1915 at the World's Fair there, watching the greatest aviator of the time fly, and it was a man named Lincoln Beechey. And I had never heard of Lincoln Beechey, so I looked into Lincoln Beechey a little bit and discovered that he was this unbelievable character. And with all apologies to Chuck Yeager, probably the greatest aviator that ever lived. He did tricks that were considered absolutely impossible. 24 people died, other aviators died trying to do his signature move, the dip of death, where he would head straight down and pull his airplane out 200 feet 100 feet from the ground and come to a perfect landing. And remember, back then, the airplanes, they didn't have bodies and they didn't even have seat belts half the time. They were just basically open frames. So I'm reading about Beechey, and it was so he was so compelling that I did more and more research, and I discovered that not only was he was he as famous as he was, but there was this whole crew of early aviators, exhibition flyers. So I went and I said, I have to write about this. So I put together a proposal called The Exhibitionists and gave it to my agent. And my agent came back and said, well, this is good, but can you, agents are, all they care about is how many books you're going to sell. I don't care about what's in it. So he said, well, can you put the Wright brothers in it? I said, well, I guess I can. So I looked into the Wright brothers, who at the time were unquestioned pioneers of flight and invented everything. And what I started to discover about the Wright brothers was that, as was true of many other inventors, they didn't do all the stuff they were supposed to have done. And other people did a lot of the stuff that they were credited for. And those people, like Glenn Curtis, most prominently, were often, if not lost to history, buried by this whole Wright brothers mystique. So I revised the proposal entirely, and I called it Birdmen, and the exhibition flyers are still in it prominently. But the book that really discusses the differences between the Wright brothers' image and their actual achievements was much more fascinating, particularly since, when somebody does something like that, they start to become deified. And the Wright brothers, I discovered, were very, very flawed people. They were human beings. They had a lot of flaws, and particularly Wilbur, but Orville too. And that Curtis was much more prominent. In fact, if you look at a list of things in modern airplanes, the technology, aspects of technology that the Wright brothers invented, the number is zero. If you look at the things that Glenn Curtiss invented, it will fill 3 pages. Landing gears, steering wheels, landing a plane on the deck of a ship. He he did ailerons. Curtis applied ailerons. He didn't actually invent them, but the other ones he invented. So this struck me as Glenn Curtiss was somebody who, I mean, the Wright brothers, what their initial achievement is unquestioned. But beyond that, um, that story really changed from the public story, and I was fascinated by it, and that's what I wrote.
Yeah, can definitely relate to that. And first learning about Curtis definitely is quite I think there's not much more motivation than trying to pretty much uncover the truth about almost underrated figures of history.
Well, yeah. I mean, I'm a historian. I write an all. I write. I've written fiction. I've written early medical thrillers. And what you discover is that, first of all, end of the 19th century, early 20th century, which is my period, was this amazing period of innovation.
Mm-hmm.
You got the automobile, the airplane, the submarine, refrigeration, commercial use of electricity, Freud's theory of the unconscious mind, Einstein's relativity. We look at our period now as this amazing period of innovation, which it is. But back then, the world between 1880 and 1910 just totally changed.
Yeah, absolutely. Um, so for our next question, so in your book, you sort of go into depth about the Wright brothers versus Curtis, not only in terms of like contributions to aviation, but also their personalities. The Wright brothers and Glenn Curtis seem to have pretty contrasting personalities, you might say. How did their attitudes towards innovation influence their respective approaches to flight and innovation?
Actually, there were a lot of similarities. Both of them. Well, first thing we have to do is separate Wilbur and Orville.
Mm-hmm.
They were not a match set. Orville was the older, excuse me, Wilbur was the older brother, and he was the older brother in every way. He could be very overbearing, very sarcastic. Um, Wilbur was one of the great instinctive engineers, scientists this country has ever produced. One of the things back then is that all the people who did the submarine, the airplane, the automobile, all of these people were self-taught. None of them. There were no such things as engineering schools. So what you had here were people who had to figure stuff out on their own on the fly. And Wilbur was brilliant. There was no question. And what that initial achievement was staggering. But beyond that, um, the Wright brothers, after they flew a Kitty Hawk, came home, and instead of making their invention public, the first thing they did was hire a patent lawyer because there was something called a pioneer patent, which was an 1896 case, I think, Westinghouse versus Boyden Power Brake. And what a pioneer patent said was that if you invented something that was so groundbreaking that it changed an entire technology or way of doing something, that your patent applied not only to your own specific invention, but everything that came afterwards that was derivative. And so what the Wright brothers wanted was a monopoly, and that was their sole focus. And Orville, he Orville was just as focused on this, but Wilbur was the great mind. Orville was a terrific technician, but nowhere near the insight that Wilbur had, and Wilbur often lost patience with him. Curtis also was driven. I mean, Curtis wanted to make money. you know, they wanted, if Curtis could have had a monopoly, he would have been happy to take it. But he wasn't as focused on it. Curtis was more focused on moving the technology forward than the Wrights were. The Wrights, in fact, one of the reasons that none of the Wright technology is applicable to modern aviation is that they basically stopped. After Kitty Hawk, they didn't fly publicly again for 3.5 years, and then only because other people had started flying. So their whole focus was they invented this, they wanted to make a ton of money off it, they wanted a monopoly, they thought they earned it, they thought they were entitled to getting a piece of the cost of every airplane that was sold, like forever. Curtis was, look, as I said, he wanted to make money, but he did not, his focus was making money by continuing to improve the product. Whereas the Wright's focus was to make money without improving the product. They wanted to make money off other people's improvement of the product. So in that, they were very different. But they were all driven. They were all very focused. They were all brave. Curtis, Curtis almost died over the Hudson River. He was almost thrown out of his airplane. Unbelievably, not until 1910 or 1911 did they start using seatbelts. They would bounce around when Curtis flew down from Albany to Manhattan. It was like riding a Bronco. And he, at one point, he went over Storm King Mountain where the Hudson narrows and the air currents are treacherous. And he was like thrown up in the air and had to hold on to the steering wheel as if he was on a horse. And then he settled down in a seat, but he could have easily just been thrown out. And in fact, Harriet Quimby, who was this beautiful, brilliant flyer, the first woman to fly across the English Channel, she died in 1912 because she fell out of her airplane in Boston. And it boggles the mind that they wouldn't have thought, with all of those air currents, just put something there to keep you from falling out. But it took 3 years.
Wow, that's the first time hearing about that Hudson Albany Flyer story. That's really
Yeah, that was a very big deal, flying from Albany to Manhattan,
mhm.
and or I think he landed in the Bronx actually, but Albany to New York City. But yeah, in Storm King, I used to live there, and the river narrows very, very drastically. That's where the nuclear reactor is that doesn't work anymore. But the air currents, because of the narrowing of the river, are treacherous,
Mhm.
and when you're flying, what it was a powered airplane then, but underpowered. That's the stuff that happens.
Yeah. Do you think let me think. Do you think that Curtis was their motivation of pushing aviation technology forward in Curtis's sort of era of exhibition flights, really early 1910s?
Um, Curtis was much more into it. For Curtis, exhibition flying was kind of that was part of the process.
Hmm.
The Wrights didn't want to have anything to do with it. The Wrights resisted exhibition flying ferociously until they were forced to because of everyone else making the money. And the Wrights initially tried to sue to stop other air meets. In fact, there was the early one in Los Angeles, I think in 1910. They had a lawsuit and they got a restraining order. And some people went home, some of the flyers went home, but some of them just flew anyway. The Wrights were not focused. They thought exhibition flying was cheapening or eroding their patent.
Hmm.
For them, the entire focus after Kitty Hawk was making money. They only flew initially, um, when they went to Europe to try to sell airplanes to the military, and here, after they had been rebuffed here, they were going to sell them without exhibiting them. And they went to the UK and they went to France and they went to Germany and they said, well, we have this and we can prove to you that we flew. And they said, we're not going to buy this. They were asking a lot of money. So we're not going to buy an airplane because you say it flew. You have to show us. And they resisted for 3 years until finally in 1907 they had no choice but to ship an airplane to ship an airplane to France to fly it. And that's an interesting story on Wilbur and Orville. They ship back then. You can ship an airplane in crates. All the works are in crates. The only thing that you couldn't ship were the wooden spars that went across that held the wings, and you just got those wherever you were. So Orville is in the United States. He packs up the crates and ships them off. And they get to France, and Wilbur opens them, and a lot of the things are broken. So he writes back to Orville, and he eviscerates him. How could you do this? You've ruined it. We're not going to do this. He said, I believe he said a monkey could have packed this better than you did. Turns out Orville had packed it perfectly, but when it got to France, the customs officers opened it. They took the stuff out, and they were the ones who broke it. Wilbur never apologized.
Really, nothing has ever changed with customs.
Or with brothers.
Yeah. Family. Did you have to rely on any interesting sources when writing Birdman?
Oh, that was most of the fun, because there are sites where the early magazines, aviation magazine, are online, not just the text of the articles, but the actual pages. And you can just flip through, and then there's newspaper sites. But these aviation aeronautics, they were great. You just flip through, and because people, after this got going, people built their own airplanes. It was simple. It was like car nuts. And so they would sell magnetos. They would sell rubberized rubberized fabric for the wings. They would sell all the components. And in these magazines, sometimes there would be plans how to build a Curtiss airplane. Never how to build a Wright airplane. But other people on refarming, because the Europeans caught up pretty fast. So you would see diagrams and schematics and, how to build your own airplane at home. Not a model, the real thing. So these were fascinating. And then, of course, the articles, you really got a sense of the politics, of the money involved. You got a sense of the court cases. There were the kinds of quotes, the kinds of damning quotes about, say, the Wright brothers coming on and just refusing to let the process move forward on its own. And the comments, because they started out, of course, as heroes, but they ended up being pretty much despised through most of the aviation community, because they were holding back everyone else, because you didn't know if your invention was going to cost you a ton of money.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Oh, I love those magazines. Anybody could do it. I think it's Internet Archive. If you go on Internet Archive and you look at the early aviation magazines, and then you literally flip through them. You turn the pages. I love the ads. The ads were fun. You also, one of the other things was, you got a sense of all the dead ends. Some of the really screwball ideas, because there were articles about it. There was a high school teacher who tried to build a plane, and people were bringing these to air meets and stuff. And of course, they didn't fly. But because the process kind of started in the 1890s with Octave Chanute, and bringing together a lot of people who were in the invention process. So yeah, this source material. It was more fun than I've ever had researching anything. I did another book on early automobile technology and early submarine technology, and the same thing was true. It was fascinating to watch the development of these ideas through the eyes and writing of the people living there at the time. Because otherwise you look back and you go, okay, we went from here to there. But the process of getting here to there was much more interesting than the actual here to there.
That totally makes sense. And getting a little glimpse of aviation culture.
Oh yeah, but it was true. It wasn't just aviation. The same thing was true with automobiles. The same thing was true. Inventing the carburetor was this fascinating process that started in the 1870s, and just how that's the other thing for someone like me. I love the advancement of knowledge, and you just watch little by little. Aviation starts with Otto Lilienthal in Germany running down a hill with wings strapped to him.
Mm.
And he looked like a loony, but he did 10,000 of these, and he was the one who discovered certain aspects of aviation and airfoil construction, airfoil being the wing, how it's shaped. He did ratios to know just how much the camber changed, which is the curve of the wing, that it has to be more at the front and then taper back slowly. And you just watch the development. And Lilienthal eventually died. He, on
Yeah.
one of his, I guess I think it was 1896. He goes down a hill and he's up in the air and he caught a thermal and he crashed. And then it's funny, they come to him and he had broken his spine and he died the next day. But his first words were, "Sacrifices must be made." Now I don't know if he actually said that, but it's a really good story.
I hope
Yeah,
one can hope that he said something.
yeah. But you just watch that, and so all of this material that that I think made the book so much fun was that it's available to anybody, and that's one great thing about the internet.
Yeah.
This book would have taken me, if I had done this book before the internet, before you could access this, would have taken years longer.
Hmm.
But you just sit at home and you just sit, and I said my wife's a historian also, and just look at this, look at this, look at this, and then she says, don't bother me, I'm doing my own. But it was really fun stuff.
Absolutely. I love Internet Archive personally.
Yeah.
During when you're researching all these events, what event from the pioneer era of aviation really captured your interest the most?
You know, there were just so many. Watching the invention, for example, when Curtis decided that to land, he was the father of naval aviation. And it's a funny thing is I live in California now, right north of San Diego, where he came and started
Oh yeah.
the first naval aviation in Mare Island. But for example, so Curtis figures out what they did was they put boards across the top. They didn't have aircraft carriers. So they did this flat deck on a cruiser. It's relatively short. And the end of it is right before the where all the people are on the bridge. So how do you stop it? Well, what Curtis did was he said he put sandbags on either side of this deck that they built, ran rope across them, a series of them, all the way beginning right at the end where the ocean began, and right to where if it doesn't stop, it's going to crash into the conning tower, whatever. I'm not a Navy guy, but and that is the same. And then he put a hook on the bottom of the airplane, a tail hook. That is still the way. That's what I mean about Curtis being so important. That is still the way they stop airplanes on aircraft carriers with a tail hook. Except, they catch one cable, but Curtis didn't have cables, so he had sandbags and ropes and just a series of them. So you watch that, and then Gene Ely, the first guy who did it, it's foggy. And so you have to come in landing on a deck of a plane where you had to really you needed the whole area. You can't overshoot it. You won't
Hmm.
stop. And if you undershoot it, you're going to crash. And Ely, it was on a foggy day and he just barely made it. And it stopped the first time. It stopped and they had, people's wives on there. It was a big deal. And it stopped feet from crashing into where it would have hurt or killed people. So that was interesting. How Lincoln Beachey died was amazing. He I said about the dip of death. So he goes up to 5,000 feet, heads straight down, and then pulls it out at the last minute. Well, he had done that in biplanes at the San Francisco World's Fair a month after Lefty Gomez saw him fly. February 2002. This is March. Beachy is going to do the dip of death, but there's something new about it. He is going to do it in a monoplane, which he had never done before. And because the Wright brothers canvas wings they had now had ailerons, they could make the wings out of metal, and they had even a basic fuselage. And what metal did they use? Well, they used the new miracle metal that had just come into industrial use, aluminum. And aluminum has very interesting properties. It's extremely light and extremely strong, but anybody who's ever used foil knows it folds easily. So Beachy goes up to 5,000 feet, heads straight down, and the wings fold up. He crashes into San Francisco Bay. Everybody assumes he's dead on impact. They finally go down, they send divers down, and they find him wrapped in the cables that had come loose in the crash. All he had was a broken leg. He had not died in the crash, he had drowned. So the greatest aviator who ever lived died of drowning. I mean, that's the kind of stuff you can't buy it. And there's just one after another, after another, after another. It was just, I was knocked out because modern technology. You might go, wow, look at AI, look at all this, but you can't see the process.
Mm.
You go on the internet and you go, oh boy, look at this, I can do this, but you don't have to see the process. All you know is what you can do with it. Back then, you could watch this process develop step by step by step by step. Very cool.
Yeah, absolutely. The Lincoln Beachy, whenever I talk about the Hudson Flyer, I always point out the floats on the side. It's like, so Curtis, I believe it was before the Beachy crash because it's 1910, right?
Yeah.
But yeah, I put it. Well, I was like, yeah, you don't want to end up like Lincoln Beachy. You don't want to be wrapped up in your cables. You want to make sure you're
Yeah.
afloat.
Yeah. But it was in between, I think, 1908 and 1912, a flyer died on the average of every 10 days. And they were, it was often, it was really gruesome stuff because the crowd would charge the scene and
Mm,
get souvenirs. Like pull a guy's clothes off or pull a piece of the airplane. I mean, there's somebody mangled because there were no parachutes. I mean, they actually, Thomas Baldwin had invented the flexible parachute, but nobody took them. And so there, you just these horrific crashes, and the crowds are running and pulling pieces off. It was reasonably disgusting.
yeah. Have you seen? Well, I bet you've seen. Was it the Great Waldo Pepper?
Yeah,
One of the
yeah,
scenes that was a very upsetting scene when they charged
yes.
the
And
wreck.
but that's the way it happened. And eventually, they would um, they had police on horseback to keep the crowds away. Uh, and because originally only the flyers' friends were there, because people didn't do it by themselves. Generally, there was in exhibitions or there were other people around, and they were the friends would go and try to keep the crowds away. But eventually, they just used mounted police. It was like riot control.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, very very grim time in aviation, but very
Mm.
exciting.
Yeah, well, they also did incredibly new stuff. So another Beachy story. This was another. I'll give you two of my favorites. In the Chicago Air Meet, I think it's 1911. He wants to break the altitude record, which was like 10,200 feet, and they had something called a barograph that would measure altitude. It was inexact, but pretty close. So Beachy's in a Curtiss airplane, and he realized that the only way to break the record is to use all his fuel on the way up. And so he does it. He takes it off the megaphone man. And remember the crowds, you're talking about a quarter of a million to a half a million people. The stands held 25,000 people, but along the Chicago River, or along Lake Michigan, they were just packed. I think there were close to half a million people, and it's the last day. So the megaphone man goes, and Beachy gets in his airplane, and he's circling and circling and circling, and he gets there, and actually he broke the record by about 400 feet. And then it's a little dot in the sky because he's 10,000 feet up. Now remember, they had no fuselage, so they're freezing up there. They'd stuff newspaper in their clothes to keep warm. and they see the dot get bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. And sure enough, as it gets visible, the propeller isn't moving because Beechey had no fuel. They call that dead sticking, which, I mean, there's a film of this German World War I ace dead sticking from 200 feet, which was considered this huge achievement. Beechey's dead sticking from 10,000 feet up, and the dot gets bigger and bigger and bigger, and he's out over Lake Michigan. And anybody who's knows Chicago is not called the Windy City for nothing. And he lands not 200 feet from where he took off in a perfect landing. This was just incredible stuff. There one more Beechey story. So the next year, he goes to Chicago and he announces that he has trained a French woman named Clarice Levasseur to fly as well as any man. And everybody scoffs. So the megaphone man comes, announces Clarice Levasseur. There are pictures of this, by the way, in the newspapers. And a French woman, all in a very, very heavy coat and a big hat, a rather small, stocky French woman, comes out, gets in the airplane, takes off. And it is immediately apparent that not only can Clarice Levasseur not fly as well as any man, she can't fly at all. First thing, it goes up, buzzes the crowd, misses the heads of the spectators. And remember, this is again hundreds of thousands of people by inches, goes back up, goes close to the water in Lake Michigan, missing it by inches, careens out onto Michigan Avenue with the wheels bouncing on the top of automobiles. I mean, this is all in the Chicago Tribune, I believe, or one of the Chicago newspapers. Bouncing, and that's why the research was so much fun. Bouncing the wheels on top of automobiles, and people are going, because they don't want to see this poor woman die. And then the airplane comes and careens again, and so it goes out over the water, and then eventually Clarice kind of gets a little bit of control and does some basic tricks and lands the airplane, and everybody is like so relieved that she didn't die. And Clarice gets out of the airplane, takes off the hat, the wig comes with it, and there's Lincoln Beechey. All of these things that looked like they were near death accidents, he could fly and bounce his wheels off the top of automobiles. This was one of the most amazing feats of flying that, and again, it's in the newspapers. So that goes back to the research question. So those are two of the other things that he flew into Niagara Falls and the bridges. It was just an incredible period. Really fun to write about.
That's very funny.
There is a picture, and I think that's in the book, of Clarice or Beechey with his hat and the wig on.
Quote unquote, Clarice.
Yeah, and he flew. And by the way, after that, he flew and drag a lot. I would just, he loved women. He had his wife divorced him because he was a serial philanderer, but he loved dressing in women's clothes and flying.
I wouldn't expect a guy like him to be any other way, honestly.
Yeah. Oh, he also had bank accounts. The other thing was he had bank accounts every time because he never trusted. His wife was after his money. So every time he got paid in a town to do exhibitions, he was making a lot of money. 20 million people estimated saw him fly. He'd open a bank account. He had all these bank accounts. I guarantee you some of those bank accounts still exist and the money's still there.
It's a long time for money to just sit. Next question is, what are your thoughts of the Wright brothers and their portrayal in modern culture?
Well, I kind of touched on that. I think,
yeah,
look, they did what they did again. What they did cannot be diminished. Now, what's interesting is that wing warping, which is their Wilbur's brilliant, Orville had nothing to do with any of this. Wing warping, which is that one set in order to keep, okay, let's do it this way. Before the Wrights, everyone who tried to fly, Langley, kept their wings in this little V, a dihedral, which allows you it keeps the plane from spiraling and going into the water, because if you don't have the dihedral and the plane starts heading down, you'll go into a tailspin and crash. So everyone tried to do that. The problem with that is you can't turn. You can go straight, but you can't do anything else. Wilbur's brilliant insight was to set the wings in an upside down V, a slight upside down V, which if you go air and space in Washington, you'll see, which is called an anhedral. Now that makes the plane inherently unstable. So it will tend to tailspin and crash. But what he said was you make it inherently unstable, but then you create a means of control. And that means of control, called wing warping. Remember, you're talking about fabric wings on wooden spars, where one side would go this way and one side would go that way. So it allowed you to maintain attitude and not go into a spiral. It also enabled you to bank and turn. That was a brilliant insight. Ironically, although the Wrights get credit for it, they were not the first people to try wing warping. And I think it was 1899, a Yale physics professor named Edson Galladay flew a kite unmanned and tried wing warping, and it worked. So he goes back to his fellow faculty members at Yale, very excited about it, and they said, Edson, there's no future in it. Forget it. Just go back to teaching. And Galladay gave it up. And he later eventually went back into aviation, but he could have easily been first. But there is no diminishing what the Wrights did, what Wilbur did. This brilliant insight to set the wings in an anhedral and create a mechanism by which it could turn and maintain attitude and become maneuverable. Because it's not enough to fly in a straight line. It's like driving in a straight line. If you're if you're driving on a country, you'll eventually crash into something. So there is no getting away from that. On the other hand, to credit them with anything beyond that is just wrong, because they really didn't know how to have the plane take off. They were using a derrick with weights. They were using levers instead of a steering wheel. They were launching the airplane on a track instead of wheels. And because they stopped after 1903 and just tried to get their patent, they not only did they not move the process forward, but they actually held it back. Where people like Glenn Curtis, and not only Curtis, there were lots of people in Alberto Santos Dumont in France, who Brazilians. He was a Brazilian coiffeur living in Paris. I was teaching a totally different course once, and she insisted Santos Dumont was the first person to fly. I said, no, it's not true. And she went on to rate my professor and did very badly. She couldn't believe that. But so there's no getting away from Wilbur's brilliant insight and making it. And they had the first wind tunnel. They made it work. They were not. This wasn't like a fluke. They had to develop a wind tunnel to figure out how to make the airfoils work. They did an incredible amount of work. They tested it out on a glider. So there is no getting away from that. But the common mythology is that not only were they the first to fly, but they invented the modern airplane, and they did not do that. There was a lot of knowledge that was put together by men named Octave Chanute that they accessed, and they were friends with Chanute, and then Chanute said, why don't you share this? And Wilbur just wrote him this horrible letter. Chanute was supporting them. So it is a half truth. And there's a great line in Lawrence of Arabia. It says, a man who lies like me merely hides the truth, but a man who tells half lies has forgotten where he put it. And this is a half truth. In fact, yes, the Wright brothers deserve an enormous amount of credit. but nowhere near the amount of credit they're given. And people like Glenn Curtis and even Santos Dumont and Henri Farman and Louis Blériot, they do not get the credit they deserved.
Mhm.
They do in their home countries, but they don't get the credit they deserved beyond that, which is too bad.
Yeah, that's a shame, particularly with Chanute. Uh, I actually find it funny when you're talking about the right lever system. I know at least Ruth Law, the early female barnstormer, she hated
Right.
the Curtis control system, the shoulder yoke.
Yeah. But that was interim. The thing about
Mhm.
Curtis was he moved forward where the Wrights did not. So what Curtis did was, you asked about the difference. Curtis looked at every innovation as an interim step. He never stopped trying to improve what he was doing. Whereas the Wrights stopped dead in December of 1903
Mhm.
and didn't really start innovating again until 1908. And by then, the technology had actually moved past them. They played catch up for the rest. They didn't want to join the exhibition flyer, the exhibition team. They were forced to do it. So they started out ahead. And because they stopped, it's like a mile race where you're ahead after 3 quarters, and then you want to stop for a little while and have a glass, some water. Everybody passes you, and then you decide, oh, I really want to win, and you pick up again. It's very, very difficult to catch a leader when the leader is moving forward as aggressively as, say, Curtis did, but the entire industry, because the innovations were really coming fast. So the Wrights, after making that decision to only try for this pioneer patent and have a monopoly, never caught up again.
Mhm. We actually have an audience question that's sort of along
Sure.
the lines. John Frater asks, where did the Wright brothers hear about the Selden patent suit? How widely publicized was the auto patent fight? Was it common knowledge in the era, or did the Wrights have to dig hard to find it?
I think, well, they were roughly at the same time. In fact, I think, yeah, the patent suit against Curtis was in 1909, and that's pretty much when the Selden when Ford was sued by this company that claimed Selden had developed the first automobile. There is a possibly apocryphal. No, at one point Henry Ford visited Curtis. I'm not sure when, maybe 1909, 1910. Whether there was a spillover, I'm not sure. But the patent suit was very well publicized because by 1906 in the automobile world, there were competing auto shows. There was one with this group that had the Selden licenses, and then there were the rogues like Ford. So I don't know when they found out about it, but it was a very big deal because automobiles came to fruition before. I mean, in 1903 there was the race to death in France, and there were driving across the country, I think in 1906 and 1907. So this all that was going on with the patent suit predated it, but the Wrights made their decision to seek a pioneer patent way before any of the automobile patent stuff started. So it would be a mistake to say that the Wrights um, decided to initiate their patent suit because of what was happening in automobiles. In fact, after Kitty Hawk, they went back, and the first thing they did was to fire this guy named Harry Tolman, who was a patent lawyer, and try to get a pioneer patent. And Tolman actually told them, don't file a patent for a motorized craft. It's going to be too complicated. So the patent that the Wrights got was for a glider. There's no motor on their invention for the wing warping and the three axes of control. And I don't want to go into that, but so the Wrights were very interested. The Pioneer patent was an 1896 decision, Westinghouse versus Boyden Power Brake, which Harry Tolman clearly knew about because he was a patent lawyer. So it would be a mistake to say that uh, the Wrights were impacted by the Ford Selden case, but they certainly were aware of it, and it probably made them more aggressive in pursuit. Certainly Wilbur, who stopped innovating entirely. In 1909, they got all these rich investors, and Wilbur was supposed to go back and innovate. And instead, he micromanaged the patent suit and eventually killed him. Uh, he died. He died of. He was down 140 pounds. He was 5'10". So Wilbur was obsessed with the patent suit, so clearly he knew about it. But I don't think they had anything to do with him initiating the suit.
John Frater says, I believe Selden filed his first auto patent in 1879, then changed it a little each year and refiled.
He didn't change it each year, but yes, he did. He did. He changed it. He changed it before the patent. I think there was a period at which the patent uh, application expires. So they changed it. It wasn't just Selden. By that time, it was this group of investors. So what they did was every time the patent was going to expire, they changed it to make it to essentially renew it. But all of this really did not get started until 1903, all the patent suits, um, because there was no real cause for it. So yeah, Selden had started the Selden. If you look at Selden's quote automobile, it's basically a wooden carriage with a motor on it. It's not in any way resembling an automobile. Certainly does not resemble what Carl Benz and Maybach were doing in Germany. So yeah, Selden filed the patent. Remember, his father was a judge, so he was aware of what was going on. His father was a judge in the Susan B. Anthony case, as it turns out, and there's a town, Selden, Long Island, that is named after his father. But so they filed it, and then he renewed it, and I think by that time, by the second time through, they had all these investors in this thing called ALAM, the American Automobile Manufacturers Group, that everybody had to join because of the Pioneer patent. And then Ford, of course, refused famously.
Alrighty, let me see. John Frater says, thanks.
You're welcome, John.
Another question is, what role did the U.S. government and military play in exasperating or resolving the tensions between the Wright brothers and Curtiss? Do you think their actions were justified?
It's you're dealing. It's the same thing with true with submarines. The military comes slow to new tech. Back then, they did anyway. They came slow to new technologies. I don't think that they made the competition between Curtiss and the Wrights any different than it would have been otherwise. But what they did, because they were so resistant to new technology, they inhibited the gradual development, which would have benefited Curtiss a lot more than the Wright brothers. What really slowed it down was the patent suits just put American aviation way, way in the background. In fact, when World War I started, there was no American airplane that was deemed battle worthy. The only Curtiss had the trainer, the Jenny, and that which is the stamp that's worth so much money with the Jenny with his airplane upside down. But I'm not sure that I don't know if you can call it justified. Certainly, the Wright brothers trying to sell the military these airplanes sight unseen. That I don't, that's you can't blame the military for saying no. We want to see it demonstrated first. But I think this would have gone on anyway. I mean, it is important. Yes, the military was the obvious first place to market the airplane. What was interesting is they weren't thinking in terms of battle at all. They wanted them for scouting purposes. And then then the Lewis gun was developed that could actually shoot between the propeller, because obviously if the gun is behind the propeller and you're not timing it, it's going to shoot the propeller off. But nobody thought about that. And they, even dropping bombs, the Beachy would go and they would drop things out of the plane and have someone on the ground try to catch it, or hit targets. They did it in Connecticut. Beachy dropped something out of a plane, and so it was slow. The military applications were a lot slower to come by than any of the inventors would have wanted. But since there was no commercial aviation and you wouldn't have had an airmail, that was the only place beyond exhibition flying and beyond personal flying that people were going to be able to make any money. And then eventually, of course, that changed and there were commercial applications. Boeing in particular was very big on that and got, moved, but that's not till the late teens, early 20s. But so I don't know. I don't think it made it any worse. And I don't think that you can blame the military, although they should have seen, well, the same thing was true in submarines. Because I wrote a book on that too. They didn't get it. And
Mhm.
it was stodgy thinking, but I'm not sure how much that's actually changed.
It's interesting to hear because there's a lot of conflicting opinions that I've seen from different historians about the final resolution of the Wright Curtis suits with the
Oh yeah, the
patent pool
common
and stuff.
patent. Yeah.
At least like the U.S. government, their justification was American aviation was falling behind that of Europe. And I've heard both people saying, yes, they were falling very behind of Europe. I've also heard people saying, no, it was overblown.
Mm-mm. It's definitely not overblown. We were absolutely falling behind Europe, because the patent suit stalled Curtis, and Europe they ignored it. Remember, the Wrights brought patent suits in every country, brought them in Germany, France, and the UK, and but they went nowhere. So those innovators kept moving. It's the race. You can't stop in the middle and then expect to catch up later. So there was no question that American aviation was falling behind. And on the dawn of World War One, there was no question that in order to solve this, you had to make all the patents common, which is what they did. So the patent suits, by definition, went away, at least temporarily, in order for America to be able to build planes that could work in combat, which they actually did not succeed in doing during World War One.
Mm-hmm. That makes sense. Seems to be something that happened almost again during the 1930s, like with Germany. I think it was like the BF-109 or something really scared America into starting building monoplanes instead of those old Curtis Hawks.
Well, yeah, or you always, at the dawn of the Civil War, the American the American army was like 25,000 people, and you could go your whole life and never see a soldier. A lot of them were out on the frontier. By the end of the war, there's hundreds of thousands. You get things move forward more by necessity than by somebody's brilliant insight. They're either it's commercial or necessity, but they really move forward when somebody says, "Wow, we better fund this. We really need that." The American space program didn't get going until Sputnik. We went, oh, the weapons research, all of these military innovations are all because of necessity or perceived necessity.
Yeah, no, not much better motivation than hating all your neighbors.
Really.
Alrighty. Let me see. Does anyone have any other questions? We're getting a little bit late on into this sort of Q&A. Does anyone else have any questions before I wrap this up in terms of our last questions? Want to make sure we have time for everyone. All right. Well, as I'm asking the last one, I'll sort of look in the chat, see if anyone has
Hmm.
one. This one is one I'm quite excited to ask, actually. Do you see any parallels to the Curtis Wright feud in the modern world?
Oh yeah, Microsoft and Apple. Just it's those that parallel always exists when there are two entities that produce much the same product and uh, are competing to have it move forward. So Bill Gates and Steve Jobs, neither of whom, by the way, ever invented anything. Bill Gates bought MS-DOS, and Steve Jobs never invented anything like Henry Ford. So you have Ford and Billy Durant at General Motors. Uh, so yeah, you will always have parallels with one. Initially, remember that nobody remembers MySpace anymore, but MySpace was the social media platform and Facebook. The only reason Facebook overtook it is that MySpace, they had a lot of scandals with sexual predators and minors. And so people went off MySpace and went to Facebook. But for a while, they were competing ferociously. So the answer is the Wright Curtis feud is absolutely typical of anything that happens during any period of innovation because you rarely have only one person doing it.
It makes a lot of sense. All righty. That's all the questions that I had prepared to ask you today. Um,
Okay.
Before we finish out, does anyone else have any questions? Feel free to unmute and speak as well if you'd like.
Okay.
Oh,
Uh,
we got.
hey, thank you, John. You're welcome.
Ooh, do you want to go in once, going twice? Sold.
So, well,
All right.
thank you all for listening. This was great fun for me. I love talking about this stuff, as you might have guessed.
Yeah, thank you so much for talking about this stuff. Seem to have a lot of passion for this part of history. It's really cool.
Oh, I love history. It's really fun. It's really fun for me. It's the research is really a gas. No matter what the subject.
Hmm. Are you familiar with our Wings and Wheels event that we do every September?
I don't think so. But we're across the country now, so
Oh yeah, we do like a grapefruit like drop competition. It's to celebrate two things. Like one is the Curtis selling the A1 triad to the Navy, so doing a bomb drop exercise in Keuka Lake, but also so sort of celebrating a prank that Ruth Law played on one of her. I don't know if it was her husband or just another co-performer that she had, but she was dropping baseballs off of her Curtis pusher, just went on the ground to catch it. But one time she dropped a grapefruit on his head. He thought that he'd been basically plugged and had blood all over him. It's really just no juice from the grapefruit.
well, you need volunteers for that one.
Yeah, I don't know what it'd be like to get a baseball in the head off of a few 100 feet off the ground. Doesn't sound very pleasant.
Really. Okay, Andre, thank you all. I'm going to go take my wife to dinner.
All righty. Have a nice dinner. Have a nice night,
Thanks.
everybody.
Take care. Bye
All
bye,
right.
guys.
Bye bye.